Nothing is Forever surveys sculpture in Singapore from the 19th century to the present and is the largest exhibition dedicated to the medium in 30 years. The exhibition advances an expanded notion of the sculptural and proposes a pivotal role that artists and their diverse sculptural concerns have played in the development of modern and contemporary art in Singapore. This beautiful exhibition extends from here in the Spine Hall where we are into the Nian Kongsi Concourse Gallery right behind us. Our speakers for today are Nalina Gopal and Seng Yu Jin. Nalina is an independent curator and researcher based in Singapore, where she runs a historical research and museum consultancy in Tati. She was, until earlier this year, curator at the Indian Heritage Centre and oversaw the centre's curatorial team. She has spent over 15 years researching the history and heritage of diasporic South Asian communities in Singapore and Southeast Asia. Nalina worked closely with the exhibition curators on the section of Nothing is Forever that looks at the spiritual in sculpture. We also have today Eugene, who is the Deputy Director of Curatorial and Research here at the gallery. He is also one of the 4 co-curators of the exhibition. We're delighted to have both Nalina and Eugene here with us today as we explore the place of religious sculpture in public art from modern to contemporary times.
And I thought I'll just start the whole discussion going by kind of foregrounding, and this was also what Nalina was kind of interested in, why the curators included religious sculptures, mostly from the Sri Sivan Temple, not all, in Singapore, and also funerary statuaries from Bukit Brown. And of course, we know Bukit Brown as a cemetery, right, in Singapore. So I'll kind of rewind that back to say that this is not a new idea, right? And back in 1976, art historian T.K. Sabapathy, who is with us today, so most privileged to have Kanaga join us, curated an exhibition titled Modern Sculpture in Malaysia. So it wasn't in Singapore, but it was looking at the history of modern sculpture in Malaysia in 1976, which was held then at the National Art Gallery in Kuala Lumpur. Right? And this was really a milestone exhibition in terms of kind of constructing the art histories of sculpture, right, in Malaysia. And it was a very important overview of that history. And to prepare for that exhibition, Sabapathy approached Museum Nagara, right, to loan, and I quote, one of the most splendid bronze images, an 8-armed Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, excavated from a tin mine in the Kinta Valley. And I wanted to show that as a kind of an emblem of a distant past, not to revive any iconological scheme, but as an emblem. I failed, not for religious reasons, because the director of the museum, Sharum Yu, who was also a member of the board of advisors of the National Art Gallery in Kuala Lumpur, when I went to see him, he said, Sabapathy, I understand why you want to show this, but if you remove this sculpture from my museum, you remove the soul of my museum. So I cannot let it out of my possession. I stood up and cheered him, and I thought I would never ever hear something like that from a museum director in this part of the world. You know, where I will fight a war before I relinquish possession of this work, unquote. And I think Sabapathy's very vivid account of his attempt to loan this Bodhisattva for his exhibition on sculpture in Malaysia was really a very important instance whereby, for one, we see this notion of masterpieces and how an important masterpiece is, represents the soul of the museum, which is interesting, of course, and often is evoked even nowadays. But also, his thinking about the inclusion of religious sculptures within the broader history of modern sculpture in Malaysia. So I'll fast forward a bit to 1991, and this time not in Malaysia, but in Singapore. Sabapathy curated the National Sculpture Exhibition at the then National Museum Art Gallery. And in that exhibition, of course, Sabapathy wrote a curatorial introduction and text and mentioned about and included a discussion on South Indian Hindu temples, right, including the Gopura, right? It's a kind of monumental entrance tower into the Hindu temple, right? So I think, again, this resonance and desire to include, kind of religious sculptures into the history of modern sculpture happened, again in 1991. So fast forward once again to now, right? After this exhibition, Nothing is Forever, Rethinking Sculpture in Singapore. The curators, of course, in preparation, for the exhibition, conscientiously read whatever we could find, all the texts, and writings on sculpture. And of course, Sabapathy's writings was a very important reference point for us. And we wanted to kind of revisit and rethink and perhaps even provoke or make a proposition to include the histories of both religious sculptures as well as funerary statuaries into the history of modern sculpture in Singapore. And if you were to go into the exhibition, you will see that the curatorial is manifested as a proposition. And why do I say so? Because the religious sculptures are actually placed on what looks like a rack. And this is a rack that we often see at the Heritage Conservation Center, where these religious sculptures are currently stored or used to be stored. Right? And we wanted to kind of create this kind of form of a gopuram, which is based on 3 levels. So if you go in, you'll see it. And to kind of put this as almost as a provocation to visitors who come to perhaps think about the possibility or impossibility of including religious sculptures and funerary statuaries as part of the kind of history of sculpture here and elsewhere. So I think I wanted to kind of give this context and also to share the curatorial process in which the curators debated long and hard in terms of how we would approach it. And I will end off before passing on to Nalina to kind of talk about the Sri Sivan Temple and also to more in-depth discussions about the religious sculptures themselves. Also share that we worked closely both with Nalina as well as the Hindu Endowments Board. So I would like to also offer my thanks to both Nalina and Mr. Raja Sigar and his colleagues from the Hindu Endowments Board. And we discussed over several times, in terms of how to display the religious sculptures. And this was an important, I think, a curatorial approach for us, whereby a museum, being an institution that is highly secular, I will say, I have, some allergies to the spiritual and the transcendental, kind of things about how we can work differently in terms of our curatorial approach with religious communities, and in this case, through the Hindu Endowments Board, and also through our curatorial colleagues like Nalina, who was so generous in sharing her knowledge as well as her contacts. So I hope this is helpful in kind of setting the ground in terms of why we included these religious sculptures, and perhaps we could have a discussion about it. I would love to hear from you what you think about the inclusion of religious sculptures and funerary statuaries. So what I'm going to do is perhaps we will then have Nalina maybe share more about the Sri Sivan Temple and the whole process of actually building and making a temple. Yeah, Nalina, over to you.
Thank you, Eugene. I just wanted to start off by thanking Eugene and his team. I know Jolene is here, who were very, open when they approached me to say that they would like to display these sculptures in the show. And I think that was only the second time that I had encountered someone saying they'd want to display them, the first time being when we displayed them at the museum I used to work at, the Indian Heritage Center. And I just felt so excited that there was a moment when we were discussing something South Asian in the context of something national. And, I just felt like it was something that I had thirsted for when it came to the discussion of art and art making, as far as the different communities and their roles in this whole narrative went. I also want to thank Gillian for all the help she's actually extended to me very kindly in making this possible. And I wanted to understand for myself what these sculptures speak for me. Firstly, I see these sculptures from the Sri Sivan temple as a moment that is reminiscent of early settlement and identity formation of Tamil migrants in Singapore. I see this as a moment where they are displaying their identity not just for their own community, but for others, and for them to sort of be able to connect with their roots in a very open and public space. I also see the sculptures reminiscent of the whole notion of patronage when it comes to temple building. Because, of course, when you look at the more grandiose temples in the subcontinent, most of them benefited from royal patronage. But in the case of the diaspora, what you have are communities, community organizations, or even guilds, as in the case of, say, the Natukute Chettiars, or individuals who are affluent coming forward or collectively to fund temples. And this, of course, then consequently impacts the scale, the grandioseness of these temples that are constructed. I also see the sculptures as a reminder of an enclave that existed in that time in Dobigot, which is such an urban moment now in our geography. Perhaps the things that we access it for so utilitarian, but, a reminiscence of really a very early settlement of Indian migrants on the island. I also see the sculptures as a moment that reminds me of the whole idea of renewal and circulation in how the diaspora connected with the source community. The fact that there is a community of sculptors or architects who are brought in to actually facilitate the renewal of these temples points to the connections that the diaspora retains with its source community, and really sort of acts as a metaphor for the whole idea of circulation, which is so important when we consider diasporas as opposed to something that is entirely severed in terms of a journey. I also wanted to lastly look at the whole idea of the dichotomy of permanence and impermanence that these sculptures really embody. Because these sculptures themselves also talk about the harrowing journey the Sri Sivan temple had, in the number of threats it had to its permanence, where it was located at Orchard Road. And I'll come to that when we look at some different images of the temple over time. So I just thought that these were some ideas that struck me as important for me from the social history perspective of why these sculptures would be included in an exhibition when it comes to the history of Singapore or the history of the Indian diaspora here. And as Eugene was saying earlier, I think, how they are displayed. I know we have some of my former colleagues from the Heritage Conservation Center here, and it's quite interesting how the gods decided how they want to rest, because, the shelves that were built in some way has become, almost, almost similar to the Gopuram format. Like Eugene was saying, the whole idea of a tier, the whole idea of structure that is layered. And I know that they've tried to evoke that memory of how they rest in the exhibition. I know that I tried to push to have a more tiered idea that would really sort of bring across even more blatantly the idea of temple architecture and the Gopuram, so that more perhaps traditionalists would be able to resonate with how the sculptures were displayed, because of course these are not any other sculptures but sculptures that have now been divorced from their religious setting. So I think that was a discussion we had, but I think I quite applaud the steadfastness of Yu Jin's team, because they really wanted to perhaps use this as a moment to lament also how some of our past is now more in store than it is in public, when these were actually very, very public aspects of how they were consumed in Singapore in the past. So I will come back to each of these sculptures later and the ones that were picked. But first, I wanted to dwell a little bit on the Sri Sivan temple itself, and to just go over what little images survive of this temple, whether it is in the archives of the temple or whether it is in the National Archives or anywhere else that I might have come across. So the Sri Sivan temple used to be located along Orchard Road. So what you see on top was the side that was facing Orchard Road, and what you see below, which is the Vimanam, or where the sanctum was located, which faced Penang Lane. So as you can see from the image at the top, I'm sorry, it's a little small, but if you really peer hard, it's worth peering at. You'll see that in the top of the image, you see some of the sculpture that's shown in this exhibition, whether it is Shiva and Parvati seated on Nandi in the central arch, or whether it is some of the, Bhutaganas or the attendants of Shiva who are actually placed along the boundary walls at the top, or whether it is Nandi, the mount or the bull that Shiva is usually seen seated on. So these are some of the sculptures and how they would have been originally placed in the temple. If you look below, there's an image of the Vimanam. And I think this is perhaps one of the most, traditional aspects of the temple's architecture that we can still relate with in terms of what you might see at some of the other temples that still exist in Singapore. Whether it is the Sri Mariamman temple or any of the other temples, you see the Vimanam above the shrines at the temple. So, you can see that this was definitely a humble temple. It did not clearly enjoy the patronage or the influence that the Sri Mariamman temple, the Sri Srinivasa Perumal temple, or the Sri Veeramakaliamman temple for that matter wielded. And these were, of course, some of the contemporaries of this temple. In terms of its size, in terms of its architecture, in terms of the ornamentation and the sculpture that you see, it clearly did not enjoy the same extent of patronage or funding. This is just an early document that shows the purchase of land for the temple from the collection of the Hindu Endowments Board. And it actually mentions 2 trustees in it. And it was just something that I picked up out of interest because these were names that I had not come across, and I just wanted to share them with you. But I'll quickly move on to these, which are more interesting. So these are plans that were drawn up in 1898. So a gentleman called Nagappa Chetty and his wife, themselves funded as well as raised funds from others in the community to reconstruct the temple around that time, because before then it was more of an impermanent structure. And the images I showed you earlier were actually from the 1970s. So this is actually only what survives from the pre-World War II period, because the temple suffered some bombing at that time. So it was destroyed. We have no images of what it looked like before the mid-20th century. So this plan that was submitted by Tom Linson on behalf of Nagappa Chetty and his wife shows us what it might have looked like back then. And in the early 20th century, following the renovation of the temple using these plans, I'm not sure how much of these plans they finally executed, was when the consecration ceremony was held for the first time for the temple as far as records go. This is actually an image of the temple that shows you some of what existed post-World War II. So after the temple suffered during World War II, B. Govindasamy Chettiar and Pakrisamy Pillai decided to raise funds to have the temple reconstructed in the 40s itself, in 1943. So what happened then, of course, is that they couldn't actually bring in people from India to build it. So they actually worked with Chinese contractors to quickly reconstruct the temple at that time. So you see that the facade is quite humble, and you see very little sculptural detail there as well, except for the inclusion of the Nandi. And I don't know if some of this had survived from the previous form of the temple and then were just quickly integrated here. I don't really have too much information about how what little sculptural detail was incorporated in the 40s came about. Just very quickly, I just wanted to show you an image of a gopuram that you might recognize from, say, more grandiose temples, and this is clearly absent in this particular temple site, and it again points to a few considerations, of course, because this temple was built right on the street and on such an important street. It didn't perhaps have the space to be able to do so. It takes on the format of a more simple temple, which doesn't have this elaborate gopuram, but it does have that facade with a small gopuram, really still symbolically contributing to that idea of a threshold. And if you look at the whole concept of the layout of a temple, which is really interestingly developed horizontally more than so vertically, when you look at the metaphor that they use in traditional architecture, temple architecture, it is that of a human body lying down, and the temple gopuram being the feet, while the sanctum being the head. Sorry about that. The sanctum being the head. So I just wanted to show you the feet, because that is literally usually the first part of the temple that we see before we enter it. And then here you have some images from the 1950s that show you the head of the temple, the sanctum, the Vimanam. So I have some videos to show you actually the process of how this is made, because one of the most common questions I had from people was, were these entirely made in India and then shipped here, or were these made here? So I thought we could all collectively look at the process of how these elements are actually made for us to collectively realize how they would have actually arrived here. So this is actually just a quick time-lapse video, and I've put in the credits for this. So it shows you how an archway that is quite similar to what you see in the Sivan temple, being constructed. And it shows you the craftsman putting in all of the detail. Now, this would have an iron and a brick core, onto which cement is then applied in layers and then molded to the designs that they want, or of course etched. Now, if you see the history of when cement comes into the use of temple architecture, it is in the late 19th century that you see cement actually is a material that they are using in construction. And by 1904, you have the first cement factory set up in Madras, and therefore you see that cement then prolifically is used in construction, whether it is for sacred or secular sites. So in the case of the Sivan temple, because it was entirely, as far as we know, constructed in the 20th century, cement has been used as the primary material. And as you can see, this would have had to be done on site. This is a craftsman who is actually developing the Vimanam, the central sanctum's dome, an onion-shaped dome. And you can see here again that it is something that would have had to be done on site. So to answer those questions that I had earlier in terms of how the temple architectural elements were developed in conjunction with craftspeople, the answer really is that they would have been brought here to work on site to develop the elements required for the temple's architecture, be they sculptural or architectural, on site, requiring them to stay here for a protracted period of time. As you would see if, so actually the Sri Mariamman temple as well as the Sri Dandayatapani temple, which is located at Tank Road, are both currently closed, in parts, or at least have some activity going on there because they are both actually scheduled for their consecration ceremony in the first quarter of next year. So if you visited, you might be able to see some activity in terms of the rejuvenation of the architecture happening. In terms of the temple and its impermanence in terms of its architecture, I also just wanted to show this image because you see the atap structure that was at the back of the temple. So it's a combination, and perhaps this is how the temple started out. Before there was the whole construction of cement and other materials used. So it just sort of shows you the different aspects of the architecture of the temple and the different phases the temple has gone through in terms of its physical existence. Now coming to the sculptures, and I know that I think rather that the team wanted to consider if these sculptures are art and if they should be included, and sort of ask that maybe slightly provocative question to the visitor, and if they think that this should be really part of that whole narrative. Now, I think there's no doubt in the sense that the making of these sculptures is an extremely artistic process. Even though it might be seen as a craft and as a skill, there's no denying that, for instance, the expressions of each of the sculptures is unique to the craftsperson who is making them, and it is unique in how it is colored. It is unique in how the form is achieved. So the artistic element to the sculptures is undeniable. But whether they were to be consumed as art for the sake of art is another question entirely. Whether they were intended to be removed from the temple and brought into a museum, and if that idea ever struck the makers, is something that is entirely arguable, because we have no idea that anybody intended for it to be consumed in a space outside of the sacred. Now, of course, when we talk of art in the instance of these sculptures, and of course in relation with other Hindu sculpture that one might be exposed to, the artistic quality of these sculptures might also then come into question. But having said that, if this is the only thing that survives a certain trial, a certain time of trials for the community, perhaps it is something that everybody was invested in making happen, and therefore it is art that happens in within constraints, within certain conditions, and perhaps it is not something that might happen, similar to what might happen when there is so much more nourishing art in that sense for me, especially in the case of these sculptures, because there are so many considerations for when the craftsmen are brought in here, whether it's access to the craftsman who is available and whether the best are available, and all of those things that determine, of course, how these sculptures eventually turn out. And I think also in terms of this particular set of sculptures, I think it's also important to point out that they were part of the architecture and they were not really part of the worship space as such that is inside the sanctum. So in that sense, again, the artistic quality would definitely be different. So I know, if you see, for instance, all of the bronzes or the stone sculptures that you might see in a museum that's just across the street from here, that dates to several centuries before, the artistic inspiration and the style is, of course, going to be on an entirely different level of conversation. But here, I think also it's important for us to realize that the fact that these are in the museum is also possible because they were not worshipped. They were not intended for worship. So they were parts of the temple that could be let go in that sense. And I think, together with these sculptures, there are also the sculptures that were the movable ones from the Sri Mariamman temple that were donated later, of course, in 1990, which were the Utsavas, or the movable images that were actually donated to the National Museum as well. And some of those are on display too. And I would ask why you didn't consider having some of the polychrome on display as well as these, because they show an entirely different level of artistic input and craftsmanship in wood. So coming back to these two images, I mean, I think what is interesting is that the way that you've placed them in some loose way follows how they were set within the temple's walls and the gopuram. So, you know, of course, the central arch had this image of Shiva and Parvati seated on Nandi. And, you know, these three are really sort of a core triumvirate as far as Saivite architecture goes, and you see them recurring very frequently. And of course, this image of an attendant scene on the bottom right is the one that, if you peered at the image I showed earlier, you would have seen many such Bhutaganas or attendants actually, you know, decorating the boundary walls of the Sri Sivan temple. You know, earlier I think I spoke of how the sculptures also speak of a moment of syncretism in terms of, you know, worship in the diaspora. So if you look at some of the worship spaces that emerged in the diaspora, there are a lot of instances of shared worship space. In the Sri Mariamman temple, you have the worship of the Shakta tradition, or the worship of the mother goddess, but you also have space that is allocated to Rama because of, you know, patronage. So you have the Kodanda Ramaswamy, you know, shrine within the Sri Mariamman temple. And if you look at an inscription that is located along Hastings Road at the Little India Arcade building, which actually used to be, which is located at a site which belonged to the Sri Mariamman temple and then eventually transferred to the Hindu Endowments Board, you'll find that in the inscription at the outset, it starts off with incantations that invoke, you know, the mother goddess Shiva as well as Vishnu. So it really points to this idea of shared worship space, of syncretism, which is more possible in the diaspora as opposed to in the source community, perhaps, because here, I mean, there is some room for negotiation. And I think it's interesting. I just wanted to use these sculptures as a gateway to talk about that idea of shared worship space in the diaspora. And that's what I felt like these three particular figures of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, you know, evoke for me. And of course, typically you wouldn't see shrines dedicated to Brahma, but it's very common to see Sudai or, you know, these kind of stucco figures of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva incorporated whether into the gopuram or other parts of the temple's boundary walls. Yeah. In this particular sequence of images, I just found, you know, at a school in Madurai that they were actually still making images that are quite similar to the one of Shiva that you see on screen. So you can see the process of how these sculptures are made. You see the central brick core. You see then the building of the cement layer and all of the, you know, subtracting and the additive methods that are used to create the sculpture. And then, of course, the finished image, which is still fairly close, perhaps a bit more rotund in face than the version that you see on the right. So I just wanted to also talk a little bit about this not being something that is a dead practice, but it is very much a living practice, albeit, of course, operating in very different scales. And here again, I just wanted to show you a video of how such cement or Sudai sculpture are usually made. So that's the rod that acts really like a central armature and provides a sort of a shape for the structure onto which then the brick is applied. Of course, previous to cement, they would have used lime plaster, you know, stucco figures. But these cement figures are really quite symptomatic of what's happening in the 20th century. And lastly, just to sort of also talk about these three images, perhaps the most, you know, relatable in some ways, I think, because of different ages being able to just sort of look at them for what they are without having to guess what they are, which can very often happen with Hindu sculpture. So in this particular instance, you have Nandi and of course the Mount of Ganesha. So in this exhibition, again, I think in terms of the hierarchy of how they are displayed, the mounts clearly take a secondary position, which is how they would have also been. I mean, I think I showed you an image earlier of how Nandi would have occupied the boundary walls. And actually, in the central arch that you see in the 1970s, while in the middle you have the image of Shiva, Parvati and Nandi, flanking them are images of their sons, Ganesha riding a mouse, and on the other side you have Murugan. So you actually see that Ganesha image in the exhibition as well. I don't have an image of it here, which is a composite form of Ganesha seated on his mount.
I think at one point that you mentioned was really about the decontextualization of these cultural artifacts, right? So these religious sculptures from the Sri Sivan temple were taken as part of the architectural decoration, right, so to speak. And now, it's been brought to, of course, as being part of the national collection, right? And eventually, of course, now the collection of the National Museum, Singapore. And now we have shown it in this exhibition, right? In an art museum, which is the National Gallery, Singapore, right? And these religious sculptures, as you said, were not meant to be were meant to be shown as part of the gopuram, right, of the temple architecture, and not intended, probably, I would say, to be shown individually like this, in this way in which we have presented it. And not to also mention, we have shown the back of these sculptures as well, and normally you will not see the back because you see only the front when you see them on the gopuram, right, by and large. So I'm just wondering in terms of, how we have kind of presented them. And I think you brought up a very, very important point, which I think links back to how museums, in a way, through the curatorial, also decontextualizes these cultural artifacts. And in this case, these sculptures, these religious sculptures, how do we think about kind of displaying them in now a different context? Whereby its histories are also quite different in that sense of how we are locating it within kind of art history, and also the history of sculpture in Singapore. And you talked a lot about, the diaspora, right? And that offers a different entry point to think about, a different kind of context to think about these religious sculptures. So I'm very interested to hear about your thoughts, because you have also displayed them in a different context, in the sense at the Indian Heritage Center, which is still a museum in that sense. So how do you grapple with this kind of conundrum, perhaps?
What I started out with in the early slides was to try and bring some context to the sculptures. And I know that that is perhaps not always everyone's approach to how they might display, but it has been an approach, albeit maybe a conventional one, that I've taken when I've actually displayed materials, only because I felt that at the stage that we were displaying some of these materials, a lot of the history was also not necessarily known. A lot of it was either, resting in collective memory or in academic journals. And it meant that lay people may not always have had access to the history. And therefore, I felt like, it would also have to be an intersection between art and social history when these sculptures were displayed. And I think that's the sort of approach that was taken earlier. And that is just but one approach, that I would take, since it's me. Yeah. But having said that, I think also that perhaps collectively, as we are today, I think perhaps our language of traditional sculpture is as rusty as our mother tongues. So, or perhaps more so. So, how do we then understand this material is something itself perhaps is the biggest stumbling block before you even realize how you want to display it. Understanding what these materials signify can often be a bigger stumbling block, as what I have seen.
Yeah, and I think you brought an important point about the material. In fact, in the process of preparing for the exhibition, we had discussions with our conservators. So it's great that many of our conservator colleagues are also here. And one question that was always asked to the curators was like, oh, can we do this, to the sculpture, or should it be left as it is? And I get many more questions from the conservators compared to an artwork, which is clearly a sculpture. Right? I think it's in part due to what you have said, the lack of maybe research and knowledge about these sculptures, and what you have shown was really interesting, right? To see how they made it, like each sculpture actually has an iron internal core, and then you kind of build the sculpture around it, which is a very different technique from, making sculptures in the modern sense of making sculptures. So I think it's a conversation that we need to have with our conservation colleagues to think about how do we then conserve these religious sculptures, right? Not just from a material perspective, which I think is important that you have said, but also from a religious perspective. Perhaps I think we have not talked about that. And then how do we consecrate? I'm not consecrate, but how do we kind of conserve? Using particular colors that has got religious symbolism or meanings and so on. So it's something that perhaps we have not discussed. And I hope perhaps we can kind of further these discussions with our conservation colleagues.
These, again, like I was saying earlier, these sculptures were not the ones worshipped, but they were actually part of the temple's architecture. And the whole idea that they would have been subjected to some kind of intervention once every 12 years is part of what they were, as in their previous avatar before they became these objects in a museum's collection. So they would have been rejuvenated. They might have faced intervention where an entirely different sculptor might have decided to, refresh them in a very different way from what the original sculptor intended, especially if they had suffered any breaks, etc. So perhaps, it might be fun to see if there can be an intersection between conservators and craftsmen to actually see how they could, consider this whole process of maintenance of these sculptures, because after all, those craftsmen would have been the ones who would have originally maintained them. So it would be nice to see how you could have these conversations across a community that is still making and preserving several temples around the world, not just in the subcontinent or here, and those who take a very scientific approach to, preserving an object beyond all our lifetimes. So I think that would be quite an interesting conversation to have.
I totally agree. I think that's something we should consider. And of course, we could speak to our colleagues from conservation as well. And you mentioned also about consecration, right? So every 12 years, the temple is sort of reconsecrated. And actually, Sri Mariamman Temple, is it this year or
next year?
It's actually next year, and preparations are already put in place to reconsecrate the temple. So I'm just wondering, in terms of deconsecrating the temple, which is something that happens, I suppose, when temples relocate, as one example. Can you tell us more about the process of deconsecrating the temple and what it actually means from a religious perspective?
To be very honest, Eugene, I'm not sure that I know the entire extent of that process, because I am unfortunately of a generation that might not have witnessed enough of that. And I think that, in terms of removing the objects, I think, from the temple, one of the rare instances I've come across in recent times is that of the Sivan temple, and, how they sort of moved all of the sculpture that were intended for worship, or what they intended to preserve, or that they intended to decide on later, moved temporarily to the Sri Perumal temple, which was along Serangoon Road, while the new site at Geylang was being prepared. So clearly, I mean, the priests are a community who are quite actively involved in that process. And of course, the community representatives who sit on the committees would be involved in the process of deciding that, removing the objects, or rather the, worship objects from the sacred space to another, rather than sort of entirely doing away with them, is the only instance I have come across it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, and we should maybe do more research into, this whole process of deconsecrating temples. I remember you once mentioned to me, but please correct me if I'm wrong, some aspects or some sculptures, religious sculptures, or what's more important in the inner sanctum, actually, when it's consecrated, it's moved to the new temple, but some other aspects of it, like these sculptures that we currently show, were left behind. Can you tell us more about this?
In the context of the Sri Sivan temple, the more permanent, the stone as well as the bronze images were relocated to the Sri Perumal temple temporarily before it was moved to the new site. But these other figures, which when they were at the Sri Perumal temple, I think they had already sort of understood what the plans for the new temple would be. And if you visited the Gelang temple, you'll know that it's entirely unlike anything the old temple was, because they wanted to create this form that was universal to a growing northern Indian population as well as a southern Indian one, even in terms of the ritual practices that the temple followed. So they realized, of course, there would be no place for these sculptures from the walls of the temple and the Gopuram in the new temple. And therefore, the year I was born in 1983, these sculptures were then donated, and I think they were moved out of the Perumal temple. Yeah. So, but, in terms of the the main permanent aspects of the worship spaces, I think those were then incorporated into the new temple.
Yes, and just to share a bit about the whole process of moving. By the way, the Sri Sivan temple is, of course, as what Nalina said, has moved to Gelang. It's a beautiful temple. The architecture, I think, is a kind of hybrid between northern and southern kind of Hindu temple architecture. I'm oversimplifying it, of course, but it's a kind of hybrid. Is that correct? Kind of.
Sort of.
Sort of.
And in terms of its ritual practices, I think it really intends to reach different demographics. So, I mean, there are different spaces that are allocated for these practices. So I think the whole idea was they wanted it to be inclusive to who they saw as the predominant congregation, for want of a better word, for that temple. Yeah.
And as the curators were researching about the history of the Sri Sivan temple, we realized how little we knew about it. And we chanced upon a newspaper article. I think we probably also shared with you, Nalina, of how all these sculptures that you see today, which is now in the collection of the National Heritage Board, actually came through because it was actually a Chinese contractor who kind of rescued them. He took the extra effort. I'm sure it was not within his job scope to do it, but he did it. He brought these sculptures down from the Gopuram, probably, which wouldn't be easy, I suppose. And then, eventually there was this whole discussion after the contractor rescued these sculptures that from the Hindu Endowments Board, it then was donated to the National Collection, which is the collection of National Heritage Board. Yeah, so it's a really fascinating story, and amazing kind of life of lives really of these sculptures. After the temple was, in a way, it would have been deconsecrated first before it relocated.
That would be the sculptures that were worshipped.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure they would have done a ritual before the sculptures moved. Yeah.
Okay, Nalina, and before we move on to talk about the artworks also in the exhibition, I'm very interested when you talked about the question of artistic expression, right, of the craftspeople, the people who made these sculptures. And I'm just curious because obviously they would follow a certain convention and iconography, which is a religious iconography that they will follow, right? But you also mentioned that there were some kind of interventions that they would have done to the sculpture, whether the specific expressions of the deities. I suppose that was what you were saying, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Or maybe perhaps certain colors and how they were kind of applied. Can you please say a bit more about this?
So I'll share an anecdote. I was I won't mention the name of the temple, but I was at a temple, and one of the volunteers was talking to me, and then he said, I'm pretty sure that particular sculpture was, less benevolent looking the last time around. There was, intervention, and then now she looks more benevolent. She looks less angry. So I think in terms of the expression, perhaps when it's painted on, there perhaps is some, individual input there. But if you look at, the form of the sculpture, I think, it does fall back on traditional texts, whether it's the Shilpa Shastra or for architecture more the Vastu Shastra, then they sort of fall back on those principles of science and maths to ensure that the form is as perfect as possible. In that, then I think I read that interview with Chandra in the catalogue, in which he was talking about his own experience in Mahabalipuram, where I think for him the biggest takeaway was really, how the sculpting community was trained from when they were young in how to prepare their body for the whole process of making sculpture. And, I think, again, that whole sort of quest for achieving that perfect form and the high artistic, involvement of each individual into how its final product turns out is such a manual process and such a physical process that I'm sure that there is something that makes us all realize that there is someone who is better at it from others. And therefore, there is, even though there is a science to it, there's a maths to it, your formula is the same, you end up with a slightly different product. And I think that would then, sort of show you that there is art in there. Because if it was otherwise such a straightforward formula, you would have everybody's sculptures looking absolutely the same. But clearly there is something that is individualistic, that is creating something so distinct each time someone is making them. So, yeah, I think that would be my personal subjective take on it.
No, and I think it's a very powerful way of understanding craft, and in a way how craft has been marginalized within art history, precisely because the assumption was that there was no artistic merit in these works that were made. They just followed strict conventions without any kind of individual, expression or kind of individual interventions into these sculptures. So, thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
And also just, the existence of master craftsmen for that matter, that there is actually a whole hierarchy even within the crafting community in terms of their aspirations for artistic excellence. I think that would tell us that there's some notion of art in their making.
Well, another question I have is about how do we, work together curatorially? And Nalina, we talked about this a lot in a previous podcast about curating in the 21st century. I think that was the title. And we talked about how curators could kind of collaborate or a different way of working across our fields. And you'd be quite surprised to know that museums are quite silo in terms of how they work. I think it's really the structures that are in place, whereby curators from an art museum like the National Gallery Singapore, we rarely go out and reach out to our colleagues. We do, but I think not enough, just so that you don't go away with the wrong idea. I'm just saying that we don't do that sufficiently or with a more determined intent to kind of work together.
As someone who is now sort of outside of the system.
So you are the best person to respond, actually.
I would say that I think often we are all trapped in the idea of doing. And because everybody has a schedule to keep up with, which might mean that everybody is trapped in the whole sort of silo world of producing and of doing. And perhaps I think what we need to create is time for conversation, and to acknowledge that that conversation may not necessarily go somewhere. But the fact that we are actually having these conversations to understand how each other thinks and how those perspectives can be brought into our own practice. And if there's some need to formalize it, maybe that could then be done between people who occupy these different sort of spaces. And also then maybe invite each other to curate in each other's spaces, because then it might also be a way of bringing in a new voice to your space and a new perspective, a new lens to your space. So those, I would say, maybe are my just initial responses to how that process of working together, perhaps starting with a conversation, can lead to something bigger. Whether it's an exhibition or a publication. I think sometimes we are also very often caught in the idea of exhibitions, but I think publications are even more important because they're perhaps lasting a lot longer and forever compared to exhibitions. So, I think that might
No,
be...
nothing is forever, remember?
I challenge that a little bit. So, I think that the room to collaborate often has to happen organically, because when we orchestrate it too much, everybody becomes resistant. But to just create that sort of climate and space, perhaps, for people to just come together, talk, and then understand how they think, would then lead to something, is what I think.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nalina, and also your generosity. It really helped the curators. I mean, for the curators of the Nothing is Forever, which includes Jolene, who's just behind, and Jia Yun and Suju, and we really came in with the kind of perspective or the kind of position that we know very little. This is not actually our area, which it should be. We should have more knowledge about it. But so I think it was really helpful for us to listen to both you and discuss with the Hindu Endowments Board.
But
that was really
Eugene,
helpful.
I just want to say also, I'm also someone who knows very little in comparison perhaps to so many more people. But I thought that what you and your team had was the right spirit, in that you acknowledged that you didn't know everything. Very often, a lot of people might think they already know and therefore don't need to consult, which is where I thought that your team was doing it right when you reached out to the Hindu Endowments Board or the National Museum and as many people as you could to see what they thought about the entire thing.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's good. We have this anxiety of not knowing. I think it's helpful and it's maybe healthy to have that. We have 2 more slides, I think, so maybe we should go before,
yes, because I just noticed that 2 other artworks in the exhibition had a sort of a direct or indirect link to the Sri Sivan temple. So I don't have the image of Kumari's 360 vessels from the temple, but this sort of evokes a memory of that, because she also had red canvases incorporated in that work, which was really her thesis project, which I think then Brother McNally insisted to keep for 3 more months. I think that perhaps in today's context, if you had it here, might generate a lot more conversation in terms of what people thought about it, because it, loaned vessels that were in the use of the Sri Sivan temple in the period when they were actually at the Sri Perumal temple, awaiting their move to the Gelang temple. And she had displayed it, the whole idea of the center for her and the whole idea of the cosmos and the idea of a spiritual center being evoked in that work. So I just thought it would be nice to draw that connection when I saw the almanac on display there, with all of the little kalasams that remind you of the gopuram of a temple in that sense. The other, of course, like I was saying earlier, there's an indirect connection. When I saw Chandra's works, the terracottas that he created at Lalit Kala Academy when he was in Madras, really perhaps seems like an accident, because what he went to do was to be in Mahabalipuram, and then he realized that he was there perhaps a little too late in life. And he then decided to pursue other mediums that he was allowed to pursue, whether it was wood or I think he sort of decided to do terracotta himself. So again, I just thought that there were so many things in that spiritual section that were directly or indirectly connected to the sculpture. So it was nice that they came together as a group, and that the sculptures were actually displayed alongside art that was created entirely in a different time period, entirely in a different purpose, and definitely not created for the sacred space, but drawing on the sacred as an inspiration, and really sort of making it more accessible to people who are part of the art world and outside of a certain demographic that is defined by its ethnicity or its religion. And that was my last slide, Eugene.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nalina. And I'm quite subtly selling our catalog here. So it has, of course, many interviews, including, of course, with Sabapathy as well as Chandra Sekaran and many other artists. Then we conducted interviews with sculptors. And when Chandra was kind of sharing with Jolene and myself, we talked to him extensively when we decided, before deciding to loan these works, because these works titled Earth were never displayed in Singapore. So they are being displayed for the first time. In fact, when both Jolene and myself were at Chandra's house, and he was also in the process of moving at that time, but thankfully we got him before he moved. We were kind of very carefully kind of unwrapping each sculpture because they were wrapped in cloth. When he brought them back from India to Singapore, it was a very painful process. I don't know if Jolene shared the same pain, because as we unwrapped, many of the sculptures, the terracotta sculptures, were broken. They were fragmented in pieces. But Chandra will come to us and say, no, don't be so sad. It's all part of, the life of the work itself, even if it's broken. Because one of the most important works from this series was actually a dancing, Shiva Nataraja, which was broken into many, many pieces. We were really looking forward to show it because it was on the catalog. So we knew, of course, the existence of this work. And when we saw it in life, it was broken. But as what Chandra said, it's all part of life itself. Things get broken. Yeah.
I just also wanted to say that the image of these two artworks also reminds us how the sacred is often a theme that some artists of diasporic roots have returned to in their journey to understand themselves and their own identity. And I think I see this in the works of Anurendra Jagadeva, for instance, across the borders. He's Malaysian, but he lives in Melbourne. I see this, in the inspiration for the art of an upcoming young artist called Vimal Kumar, who lives here. And I think that, the whole idea of the sacred is one that, and I don't think it's restricted to any one religion. The idea of the sacred is so part of it, even if you want to shun it entirely. Its absence speaks as loudly as its presence. So I think it is something that is a coming of age moment for a lot of artists. And I think that the sculptures speak quite nicely to that trend that you see in artists of that age. Yeah.
Thank you, Nalina. So maybe at this point, we would like to open up to the floor for any questions that you might have. Anyone? Yeah, this gentleman in front. Yeah.
My name is Al. I was wondering, you in the beginning you said that your choice of putting the sculptures on rack was meant as a provocation. Have you had any reaction from visitors? I'm not talking really about the press, but visitors mostly, that this is something you shouldn't have done? Or what were the reactions by the public?
Yeah, we were really looking forward to such responses, to be honest. And we do have conduct surveys. And when we conduct surveys of the exhibition, we actually do also record the comments. And the curators are really excited when we receive these comments, which we do every month now. and we have not seen any yet. So maybe after today we will. And that would be quite exciting for us. We decided to add on to the provocation by also including the accession tags. So if you look at the sculptures closely in the exhibition, religious sculptures, the Hindu sculptures, you will see the tag that is the accession number and stuff that you will see when you see these sculptures at the Heritage Conservation Center. So I'm not sure if people also noticed it. We decided to leave it as that, to question, why, and, the way that, of course, we store these sculptures, the way that we research and study and classify them, all these issues need to be questioned. Also, right? And Nalina was also just sharing with me, we have left, because we do not know the identities of these craftspeople, we have left it and within our database system as unknown, right? So it's to me, I think something that we need to rethink, because Nalina has actually found
I just saw
the
that
identity, right?
In the Sri Sivan Temple's souvenir book, they actually mentioned the name of the sculptor who was hired in the 60s to make the sculpture. So I'm not sure what was retained from the previous version, like the Nandis, for instance. But, and how much of it was made, but his name was Mariappa Achari. And, his team and he then were commissioned to actually make the sculptures, when that sort of reconstruction and the setback happened. He was commissioned to do it. So we now know a name, but we don't know which ones exactly who did again, because it's not customary practice to leave any notion of the individual in that activity that is seen as such a collective thing to do. So you never really know who it is. Maybe you might know the master craftsman if he's of sufficient name, but would you know the rest? You wouldn't.
Yeah, and this is one of the problems, right? In a sense, why craft is marginalized in art history is because the artist is unknown. Right? We don't know the identity of the artist, or in this case, the craftsperson. But I think that is something we need to rethink, right? As because in our last exhibition, Ever Present, which is really an exhibition of out of the First Peoples and the Torres Strait in Australia, they adopt a different approach to naming and these works by calling them ancestors instead of artists unknown, which is what we do currently. So we need to think about how we kind of categorize and think about these so-called nameless craftspeople, and that adds to the marginalization of craft within art history. And we need to change that, perhaps in small little steps, by, for one, through research and maybe finding out who were the master craftspeople, and maybe then we can add that into how we understand the making of these religious sculptures.
I mean, one way would probably be for any monument that is undertaking any of these restoration activities to document it. For sure, even if the smaller temples, for instance, they don't have that thread of continuity because they are very often only served by voluntary committees. So if records don't persist and last forever, perhaps then at least what is a monument, if there's some effort at the national level to do so. But, coming back to the idea of the First People's approach, and I think that whole idea of a bicultural policy to anything that is from the community, whether you see it in Australia, whether you see it in New Zealand, it's quite fascinating. But I think there's one subtle difference in that here, a lot of what we're talking about is the product of circulation. And, perhaps in some cases, literally a vendor making it, even if it was a craftsperson. So, what sense of ownership would there be if there isn't that direct link, familiarly or community-wise? And that might actually be a different kind of challenge here to consider when looking at those kind of approaches.
Thank you. And coming back to your question again, we did get one response. Sorry, I forgot. But it was on Facebook. So, I was also trawling Facebook, right, to see if there were any kind of responses to the exhibition. And one question was really about showing the back of the sculptures, which normally you will not see when you see them, as on top of the Gopuram, as part of the Gopuram. So I was wondering, Nalina, what do you think about showing the back? Because it's again a very kind of art historical approach to see the sculpture in the round. It's a very modern way of experiencing sculpture, which may not be the case for these religious sculptures at the back. It's not important at all. It's just the front. Because that's what's facing the worshippers, right, before they come in.
But
so
personally, I would be very miffed if you brought them all the way here and I could still not see some parts of them, because I think they've already transcended that whole notion of being art historical objects now. And then I would want to understand how they were made, understand its technique, and no longer sort of consider them. I mean, I think the great thing about these sculptures is now they are at eye level, because
Absolutely,
otherwise
yeah.
they were so high up, you would hardly notice the details. So, I think that, having them at this height, having them displayed this way, makes no bones about the fact that you want to dwell on the technique, you want to dwell on them in the round, and therefore I don't think you should be apologetic about it, because, any moment of consideration of them leaving that notion of sacred to this space is long gone. So I think that, it's something that people come to terms with when you're in this space. And I think that is the context the space lends them, of looking at them for how they were made.
thanks, Nalina. Now we can sleep easy.
Thank you very much. Bravo.
Question?
Thanks, Eugene and Nalina. My name is Li-Ling. I'm a docent at the gallery. I just have a comment and two questions. And a comment just to share with the curators that with regards to your attention type that you have put in onto the sculptures, one community of people who have noticed it, and that is us docents.
Thank you.
Okay. And then the first question is, Nalina, the very beautiful sculptures that were taken from the Srivan temple when it was in Dhobi God. Can you hear me? Yeah. They were very colorful, colors. But now the temple that is in the present, is it East Geylang? I've never visited it physically, but I was looking at the photographs. But they were all not colored. So is there any reason why, who would decide whether the sculptures would be with colors or without, or is it part of the architectural aspect to it?
Sorry about that. Basically, I think it comes down to the architectural style followed for the temple. And these two are very different. The old temple follows a very clearly by, at that time, a derivative of what you see as a combination of Chola, Vijayanagar kind of, traditional temple format that has come down to be the norm in Tamil Nadu, and that is transferred here. And that is the old temple that was at Dhobi Ghat. But the temple that you see in Geylang, as Eugene was making reference to earlier, does not follow that temple architectural style at all. It derives more so from Northern Indian elements and perhaps some that are modern elements to create an aesthetic that is entirely its own, as opposed to sort of for us to try to impose any one template on it. And I think the whole idea was that it is this sort of combination of different elements, I guess sort of to represent the combination kind of profile of its demographic that is visiting the temple. Yeah.
And the last question I have is, before a craftsman starts making one of these sculptures or decorative elements for the temple, does he have to go through a sort of a ceremony of blessing or sanctification, purification, whatever you call it, before you could go on to start making this piece of work that is meant for the temple?
Okay, that is a good question, because any purification is usually of the material, not of the maker, as far as I know. And I think it's assumed that the maker has led a life that has trained him to actually make something that is of a certain kind of spiritual and I guess physical characteristic. So as far as I know, most of the rituals, even right up to the opening of the eyes of the sculptures that are worshipped as deities, all of those are rituals that are directed at the sculpture rather than the maker. And I'm sorry I didn't answer part of your earlier question about who decides how to paint it. I think this is something that has many people up in arms in the subcontinent, because there has been restoration of very old stone temples with gaudy colors, etc. I think very often it comes down, if the temple is in private management and is not a site under the management, say in the case of, say here, Preservation of Sites and Monuments Board, or like in India, the Archaeological Survey of India, etc., then maybe the committees are at absolute liberty to commission whatever they wanted. And therefore it could go as subtle or as gaudy as they chose for it to be, in discussion with the craftsman, or have no opinion at all, which would result in the craftsman having his way. So, it really depends on the case by case, proposition of each temple and who comes into its management.
Okay, thank you. And maybe I could just ask another question. Are only men allowed to be craftsmen and not the women?
Well, certainly if you look at it historically, all of the craftsmen are men. Whether that is changing now, I think that might be a possibility, because I think equally women are interested in the process. I have come across women in other crafts forms, but to be absolutely honest, I've not met a Stapati who is a woman as yet, and I don't know if one exists, but I will go check it out later today.
Nalina, thank you very much for numerous illuminating observations and proposals regarding temple architecture and sculptures ensconced in temples, most particularly the symbolic, ritualistic differences that prevail from having images such as those that are on display here on the gateway, from, if you'll accept the term, the cult images which are in the sanctuaries, in the main body of the temple, which forms the purpose of convening the temple, for which prayers, the pujas, are conducted. My remark has to do with the title of the present meeting, Intersections of Art and Religion. You have talked about, both of you have talked about art and religion. I'm wondering where those such intersections might be located. There was one fleeting moment in your observations when one might have guessed at such an intersection, and when you were talking about the artistic qualities that are possible in the making of the image, which then resides in the subjectivity of the maker. That's an old story. But when you come to what is here, would the intersection be in the Ngi An Kong Si Concourse Gallery? We understand intersections as locations. Locations physically, locations psychologically, locations imaginatively. museums are potent locations. You used to run one. Seng Yu Jin is continuing to run one. So, are we supposed to say that art and religion intersect in the Ngi An Kong Si Concourse Gallery in that section where they are installed? But then they are not religious anymore. What has happened to religion then in this? I'd like to know too, because the word religion, you used a number of declensions for it. One was the sacred, which is amenable to secularization. And the other, even more amenable, is spiritual. The spiritual was claimed to be at the heart of abstraction, whereby one got to the essence of things and left away with the flesh and bones. Nalina, where is the religion? Seng Yu Jin, where is the intersection?
If I might reverse the questions and I take where is the intersection, because, when I was thinking of the title for this talk, I really had a place in my mind as the intersection. Not one that was physical, but one that was really more temporal. One that was in my mind as the intersection of art and religion, when it comes to a diaspora that has often not been talked about. When we look at the narrative on art, that literally until I see Mavis inside and the works of Anaratnam Gunaratnam there in the gallery, there isn't really any talk of the presence of this vibrant diasporic community in the narrative on art. And I felt like, this in my mind was that moment when we could actually speak of the intersections that the notion of what people needed for religion in their mind resulted in as art, in the diasporic space. And of course, I suppose I will leave it to Eugene to tell me if he thinks it resides in the Nyan Kongsi. But I think, in terms of the intersections of art and religion in a museum, even though these might be the sculptures that are devoid of worship, the notion of religion is one that is struck when you see these sculptures. The whole idea that they're Hindu, that they belong to a certain sect, that they belong to a certain religious background is one that actually is what people notice the most about it when it's displayed. I mean, that's how I've seen everybody talk about this particular installation, that installation of Hindu sculptures. Even the term Sri Sivan Temple is one that few people make reference to. And I felt like that then was a moment of intersection between art and religion for me. I don't know if it answered your question, but I'm going to hand over to Eugene to take on the other aspect of the question.
I will try and probably invariably fail. I think when we were thinking about religion, we were more thinking about kind of religion as reference, religion as a source. So let's take, for example, if you look at Chandrasekharan's work, Earth, right? And he comes out very strongly to say that his work is not about religion, very clearly. And he saw religion, in this case, of course, Hinduism, as a kind of a reference and a source, and a certain connection to his artistic practice. And so he makes it very clear that he makes a distinction between him as an artist when he was in Chennai, actually, and his colleagues who were working with as crafts persons. In fact, when he made these sculptures, his colleagues were baffled. They were like the master crafts person. They were like, "What are you doing? Why are you making these very strange-looking things that look like referencing some aspects of Hindu iconography, religious iconography, but on the other hand, it's not at the same time." And he then talks about connections between art and religion in terms of how art, like religion, construct myths. Myth making is part of both, what artists do and what religions do. And when he made that kind of connection, he thought that it was important for an artist as well to be a myth maker, which was then why he created this series based on title Earth, as a way in which he referenced Hindu kind of religion, but making very clear that it's not religious at the same time, but yet trying to make connections that both art and artists and religion and persons, kind of construct myths in that process. So I would say the intersections, it's really about how religion continues to be an important source for contemporary artists today. And it's the same, I think, also for Kumari. And that intersection is what I'm looking at, religion as a source, as a reference.
And can I also add that I see the sculptures themselves as a space of intersection, each individually, where art and religion meet. Each individual sculpture, not just the space and the gallery, but each of them embodying that intersection. Yeah.
I hope we pass. Maybe not. I will know later.
I'm just more than curious. This is to you. In looking at images, if I can use that term, in religious precincts like temples, is there provision for looking at them? That is to say, if visuality and visualness and visual appeal, visual transaction between the thing seen and that which you see is at the core of all art, wherever it takes place. That is, we're talking about visual art. In the rituals, in the devotional songs, is there the possibility of the wonder of beholding? In your conversation published there, you mentioned, I thought, movingly, of having to dress an image. And in the ultimate rituals that are performed in the Garbhagriha, the cult image has to be bathed, garlanded, purified, awoken from a sleep before it is made ready. And when the curtain is drawn, everybody cranes their neck to have a glimpse at it. And when you see, you are in turn being seen. Are these not also intersections?
Very much so. Very much
that you
so.
don't have to come to the Ngiyan Kongsi Concourse Gallery, really, because it already takes place there, the form of beholding, darshanam, at the heart of it. And this is not only spiritual seeing, and this is where perhaps images have to be made appealing. They have to be splendid. And there we say, alluring, seductive, beautiful. And all this is in the literature. Sensuality, right there. We don't have to wait till see a bronze patina, it's there. So I'm wondering whether the intersections, as you say, are already, and if that is the case, then these images that are there are not the most blessed to give that aura. They are of a secondary nature. So we can then go on to qualify the quality of these images, take it to the next step. As we do, only those who meet that quality enter the National Art Gallery, we presume. So these are possibilities too. Thank you.
Very much so. To answer in short, I think there are possibilities. I would also say that these sculptures perhaps are now the only last standing reminder of that whole gobsmacked sort of experience that people had with darshanam at the Sri Sivan temple site. That is no more. And I think these sculptures then act as triggers of those memories, of the experience that people would have had in a site that is not forever.